All right, strap in, everyone. Today we're going deep on routers, specifically how they work in React web development.
Definitely a key part of building web apps.
Yeah, and we've got a really cool set of sources for this one. They use this whole analogy of a planet called Codex,
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
where like information flows like energy, and the routes are the pathways that guide it all.
It is a really cool way to think about it. Makes it way less abstract than just thinking about, code and stuff. Really highlights how important routers are. I mean, they basically shape the entire user experience, right?
Okay, so in this world of Planet Codex, what exactly are these routes? Like, are we talking about literal signposts or like maps? What's the visual here?
Think more like actual roads
Hmm.
or paths. So each route is basically tied to a specific URL in your application.
Okay.
Like, for example, just a simple one. You've got like the slash, right? Just for your homepage.
Right. Makes sense.
Then maybe about for the about page. Products, if you're listing products. You get the idea.
Yeah. Okay. So when I'm clicking a link on a website, is that when the router's doing its thing, like figuring out where to send me based on what that URL is?
That's exactly it. The router is always listening for any changes to that URL. And then based on what it sees, it renders the right components.
So it's like a, what's a good analogy? It's like a traffic controller.
Yeah, perfect. It's making sure that all the data is flowing to the right place. No traffic jams, hopefully.
Clarify not. But okay, what about those times when you click a link and it takes you to a page, but like within a page? So I'm thinking like when you go from like a general product listing to a page for the specific details about one product, is
Yeah.
that the router again?
It is, and that's where we get into nested routes.
Okay.
So these are basically routes that exist inside other routes, so it creates this like hierarchy.
So kind of like smaller paths branching off of the main road
Exact.
so I can explore more without getting completely lost.
Yep. And it's not just about making it easier for the user. It also helps keep your code base organized. You can split things up into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Oh, interesting. So well-structured routes make everyone happy, users and developers.
Yeah, pretty much.
But if routes are like the map of our application, how does the router actually work? Like, how does it know which component should be displayed for each route?
Right, so that's where React Router comes in. It gives you these components you can use to define the routes and tell it which component goes with each.
So it's like writing instructions for the router.
Yep. Like you might use the root component, and you can say, hey, when the URL is just a slash, the render the homepage component, something like that.
Gotcha. But I imagine in a real application, it gets way more complex, right? Like,
Yeah.
what if you have tons of routes and nested routes? Doesn't that become a nightmare to manage?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It can get pretty hairy if you're not careful. And that's why, like, planning your routing structure is so important from the very beginning. And there are techniques you can use, like grouping routes together or using layout components to make sure things stay manageable. Like any big project, it's all about breaking it down into smaller pieces, right?
Right. So we've talked about how you actually define these routes using React Router, but I'm curious about what happens under the hood, when the URL changes. Does the entire page like reload every time I navigate somewhere new?
That's a good question. And actually, that's one of the biggest benefits of using React Router. Because it's a client-side router, it can do these smooth transitions without having to reload the whole page every time.
Well, interesting.
Instead of grabbing the entire HTML document again from the server, it's just updating the pieces that need to change.
That's super cool. So React Router is basically making the experience way smoother.
Exactly. And it's a lot faster for the user.
Right, because nobody wants to wait for a whole page to reload every time they click something.
No, nobody's got time for that.
So how does it know which parts to update and which parts to leave alone?
That's where React's whole component-based thing comes in.
Okay.
When the URL changes, React Router will only re-render the components that are actually like connected to that change.
So if I go from the products page to a specific product page, say products details 123,
Right.
it's smart enough to know that it only needs to update the part that shows the details, not the whole product list.
Exactly. Because each route is tied to a specific component or set of components, React can figure out exactly what needs to be re-rendered.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about the basics of routing, how React Router handles it all. What else do we need to know about this world of React routing?
Oh, there's a lot more to uncover. But maybe we should do a quick recap of what we've learned so far before we jump into the really tricky stuff.
Yeah, let's do that, just to make sure everything's crystal clear.
Welcome back. Seems like you're getting the hang of how these routes work on Planet Codex.
Yeah, Starting to make sense. But I know there's going to be more to it, right? Like
Yeah.
our sources mention these protected routes, which sound kind of serious. What are those all about?
Okay, so imagine on Planet Codex, there are some areas, like maybe the Router Knight's command center or something. You don't want just anyone wandering in there.
Yeah, true. Definitely needs to be some security.
Exactly. And that's what protected routes do. They basically lock down certain parts of your application, only let in users who are, authorized.
Like logged in, you mean?
Right, like if you have user dashboards, account settings, stuff like that. Anything where you're showing or changing sensitive data.
Makes sense. So these protected routes, do they actually, like, build a wall or something?
Well, not a literal wall, but they act like gatekeepers.
Okay.
A protected route is basically a component that checks if the user is logged in before it shows them anything, and if they're not, it redirects them to the login page or shows some kind of error message.
So it's like a checkpoint.
Yeah, exactly.
But couldn't someone try to get around that? Like, what's stopping a user from just typing in the URL directly?
That's where things get more technical. Because React Router itself doesn't handle the actual authentication.
Oh, okay.
Usually that's all done on your back end, with users and passwords and all that.
Right.
So the protected route component is just looking for like a token or some session data, proof that you're logged in, basically. And the backend would have given you that when you logged in successfully.
So that's like the router is relying on information for the back end to know who's allowed in and who isn't.
Yeah.
Got it. So if I try to sneak in the back way, the protected route's going to be like, nope, you need to go through the checkpoint.
Exactly. It's constantly checking your authentication status. So even if you try to manually type in a URL, it'll redirect you right back to the login. It's like a super vigilant guard.
Okay, so security is covered.
Mm.
But I'm also thinking about the user experience here. Being constantly redirected to a login could get annoying fast.
Oh, for sure. And that's something developers need to be careful about. One common way to handle it is to have both public and protected routes.
So basically, some areas are open to everyone,
Right.
and then others are locked down behind that login.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance between security and a smooth user experience.
Yeah, make it too strict and people are going to bounce.
Yeah,
But obviously, you can't just leave everything wide open either.
definitely not. That's where the art of web development comes in, I guess. You got to find that sweet spot.
Totally. Okay, so we've got routes figured out, got our security in place. What happens next? Like, how do we actually get the users moving along these paths?
Well, that brings us to the dynamic side of things. Let's talk about loaders.
Loaders.
Yeah.
Okay, are we talking about like those spinning wheel things that tell you a page is loading?
You got it.
Ugh, I'm not a fan of those. Give you speed.
I hear you. And that's actually what loaders help with. Think of them like scouts. On Planet Codex, they go out ahead and gather all the information before the user even gets there.
So instead of making me wait for stuff to load, they're prefetching the data, so it's ready to go immediately.
Exactly. It makes everything much smoother and avoids those annoying loading screens.
Okay, I like the sound of that.
Yeah.
But how do loaders work exactly? Like, what triggers them to start doing their thing?
So in React Router, loaders are basically functions that are attached to a specific route,
Okay,
and they run before the route's component is rendered.
got it.
So they're like little helpers working behind the scenes to make sure the data is all ready when the user shows up.
That's really clever. And what kind of data are we talking about here?
Pretty much anything. Could be simple text, images, or even more complex stuff, like data fetched from an API.
So like if I'm building an e-commerce site, the loader could grab product details, reviews, all that before I even click on anything.
Exactly. It's like having someone run ahead and get everything prepped.
I love it. But what if the data takes a while to load? What happens then?
That's a good point, because even though loaders are meant to speed things up, sometimes you just gotta wait. So it's super important to show the user something, like a loading spinner or a progress bar, so they know things are happening.
Right, because even a few seconds of just staring at a blank screen can feel like forever online.
Oh yeah, totally. People are impatient.
Okay, so loaders are all about optimization. What else can we do to make routing more dynamic?
Okay, let's move on to actions.
Actions. Okay, now we're talking. This sounds exciting.
If loaders are about preparation, actions are about reaction. Making things happen in response to what the user's doing. Remember those pathways on Planet Codex kind of pulsing with energy?
Yeah.
Actions are like that energy flowing through them.
Okay, I'm liking this analogy.
So instead of just displaying static stuff, actions let your routes actually respond to user input.
So it's like they become interactive?
Exactly. Actions are triggered by things like submitting a form, clicking a button, even just typing in a search bar. And they allow your application to, like, react to those things.
Okay, so concrete example. If I'm filling out a form to add a product, when I hit submit, that's when the action kicks in.
Exactly. It would grab the data from that form, send it off to the server, and then probably update what the user sees on the screen.
Makes it feel more like a real-time experience, right?
Definitely.
It's not just a one-way street anymore.
Exactly. It's a conversation between the user and the application.
Okay, I'm getting it. Loaders prepare everything, and actions keep things moving.
You got it.
I feel like we're really getting this routing thing down. But maybe another quick recap before we wrap things up, just to make sure it all sticks.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's solidify this knowledge before we move on.
All right, we're back. I gotta say, I'm starting to feel like a router knight myself after all this.
You're getting there. Yeah, we've covered a lot. From basic routes and nested routes all the way to protected routes, loaders, and actions.
It's been pretty wild. And I'm realizing, like, routing is way more than just connecting pages together. It's really the whole foundation of how a user experiences an app, isn't it?
100%. And honestly, it's something I think a lot of newer developers kind of miss. They get caught up in the individual pieces, the features, but they don't always think about how it all flows together.
Yeah, it's like you can build a beautiful house, but if you forget the doors and hallways, it's not going to be very fun to live in.
Exactly. And that's where really understanding these routing principles is so crucial. It lets you think big picture about how people are going to use your app and design pathways that make sense.
You know what else it reminds me of? It's kind of like storytelling.
Oh, yeah, I see that.
Like you're guiding the user through a narrative, revealing information at the right time.
It's like those choose your own adventure books, right?
Totally, where every choice takes you down a different path.
And with routing, you can do that in a web app too. Let users explore different branches of content based on what they do.
Which makes it feel way more personalized.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
not just a static experience anymore.
So, key takeaways for our listeners. What are things they should really remember about all this?
I think the biggest one is, design your routes with the user in mind.
Right.
Don't just focus on the code. Think about how it's going to feel for someone actually using your app.
Walk a mile in their shoes, basically.
Yeah. Ask yourself, like, what are the most common paths people will take? How can I make those super smooth? Where might they get confused or frustrated?
Yeah. Thinking about those things up front can definitely save you trouble later.
For sure. And another thing, don't underestimate nested routes.
Right.
They might seem like a small thing, but they make a huge difference, both for the user and for you as a developer. Everything's more organized, easier to understand.
So, good for everyone. And of course, we can't forget security, right?
Definitely not. Especially these days, you got to make sure you're protecting sensitive data. And protected routes are a great way to do that.
And then, of course, we've got our loaders and actions working behind the scenes.
Can't forget about those. Loaders make things fast. Actions make things interactive.
The unsung heroes of routing.
They really are.
Well, this has been an awesome deep dive. I feel like we've covered it all.
Yeah, I think we hit all the major points.
Any final words of wisdom for our listeners before they go out and build their own amazing routing systems?
Just remember, routing is a powerful tool. Use it to create intuitive experiences, tell engaging stories, and build apps that people will love.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing all this knowledge with us.
Happy to do it.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of React routing. We hope you learned something new and that you're feeling inspired to build something awesome. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.